Hi, I'm John, your host, and welcome to Heart of Care, a podcast by AMCU. Here, we delve into the real voices of healthcare, sharing stories of resilience, humanity, and the unwavering heart that drives it all. Join us as we empathize, learn, support, and even find moments to laugh together. Thanks for being here.
Welcome to Heart of Care Season 3, Episode 2. This season, we present The Light That Refuses to Stay Out, the audiobook adaptation of the book by Evan Hope, a deeply personal reflection on Myanmar, dictatorship, migration, medicine, conscience, and hope. Presented by AMCU Media. And now, The Light That Refuses to Stay Out by Evan Hope. Chapter 2. Before the First Word. What are we before the world finishes shaping us? I keep returning to the same question, not as a philosopher, not as a theologian, simply as a person trying to understand what human beings are before the world finishes shaping them, what it is we arrive with. Because long before children understand religion, politics, law, nationalism, or ideology, something already seems present. A child sees another child crying and becomes distressed themselves. Someone witnesses humiliation and feels something recoil internally before forming an argument about it. A stranger rushes toward danger to help another stranger before calculation fully catches up. Something responds before doctrine arrives. Before we learn the world. The older I become, the harder it is to believe human beings begin as empty moral space, waiting for systems to write themselves onto us completely. The systems shape what is already present, rather than creating morality from nothing. I do not mean human beings are naturally pure. History clearly argues against that fantasy. Children can also be selfish, territorial, cruel, possessive, jealous, and impulsive very early in life. Anyone who has watched children closely knows this too. Many researchers in developmental psychology observe something appearing in infants before significant cultural conditioning. A sensitivity to fairness, a distress at witnessing harm, a recognition of the other as real. The debate about what is truly innate and what is absorbed very early continues. But something seems to be present before doctrine arrives to name it. The first silence. I think many people remember, if they are honest, moments from childhood where conscience appeared before explanation. A moment where something felt wrong, long before we possessed the language to defend why. Watching another child excluded, hearing cruelty in an adult's voice, seeing fear in someone's face. The reaction comes first. Then, slowly, the world teaches us when to suppress it. Not always maliciously, sometimes through survival, sometimes through culture, sometimes through exhaustion, sometimes through belonging. A child may instinctively protest unfairness until they learn that questioning authority carries consequences. Another learns that vulnerability invites humiliation. Another learns that silence keeps the household stable. Over time, conscience does not necessarily disappear. It becomes negotiated. The two pulls. Every human being seems to carry two opposing pulls simultaneously. One moves toward empathy, connection, compassion, fairness, truth, and recognition of another person's humanity. The other moves toward fear, tribalism, self-protection, domination, resentment, and indifference. I know both sides of this. From the inside. I have felt the pull toward genuine care and the pull toward self-interest, and I am under no illusion about which one wins, without effort. The line separating cruelty from kindness does not run cleanly between good people and bad people. It runs through individual human beings, through families, through institutions, through nations, through entire civilizations. That is why history repeats itself so often. Human beings keep imagining evil belongs primarily to other kinds of people. And then ordinary people, under fear or ideology or humiliation or power, become capable of things they once believed unimaginable. There are people for whom the pull toward others is strong and natural, people for whom empathy is not an effort, but a default. They are not saints. They still have the other capacity inside them. But their default is toward care, and circumstances have to work hard against that. And there are people for whom the pull runs the other way, not broken by circumstance alone, but oriented differently from early on. Some people seem more vulnerable to certain destructive tendencies than others, even when raised in similar conditions. Why that is remains genuinely uncertain. Pretending it is never the case does not protect anyone. It only makes us slower to recognize when it is. Most people spend their lives somewhere in the middle, capable of genuine generosity and genuine selfishness, pulled toward their better nature by love and suffering and example, pulled away from it by fear and self-interest and the comfort of not having to think too hard. The vast middle of humanity, navigating the dial with varying degrees of success. That navigation is what morality actually is. Not the following of a list of rules, not the performance of correct opinions, but the ongoing, imperfect, daily attempt to let the reality of other people matter. Fear changes morality. Fear may be one of the strongest forces acting on conscience. A frightened person thinks differently from a safe one. Fear narrows attention. It prioritizes survival. It reduces complexity. It makes tribal thinking emotionally attractive because groups feel safer than uncertainty. Under enough fear, people begin asking, "What protects me?" before they ask, "What is right?" I do not say this from superiority. I grew up in a country where fear shaped ordinary life. Quietly. Conversations lowered when strangers entered rooms. Political caution became instinctive. Silence became part of the emotional architecture of survival. Fear changes people. Not always dramatically, often gradually enough that they barely notice themselves adapting. Comfort does it too. But fear is not the only thing capable of weakening conscience. Comfort can do it as well. A comfortable person can slowly become insulated from the suffering sustaining their stability. Entire societies can. Not because people become evil, because distance weakens emotional immediacy. The suffering happens elsewhere, to other people, through systems complicated enough that responsibility feels abstract. Sometimes I think indifference in wealthy societies is less a deliberate moral failure than a form of emotional exhaustion mixed with distance. But the outcome can still become dangerous. The person who looks away out of fear and the person who looks away out of comfort are not morally identical. Yet both kinds of silence still allow harmful systems to continue functioning. What suffering teaches. There is one experience that has more power than almost any other to move the dial toward genuine moral seriousness: suffering. Not suffering in the abstract. Suffering that is felt, faced, and processed honestly, rather than buried or redirected outward into blame. A felt understanding of what it means to be vulnerable. A recognition that the person in pain in front of you is as real as you are. This is why the greatest moral teachers across history were almost never people who had lived comfortable and untested lives. They had been through something. And what they brought back from that was not bitterness, but a more vivid understanding of what it means to be human. Suffering can also do the opposite. A person who is hurt and does not process it, who turns the pain into grievance and the grievance into ideology, can become someone whose conscience has been overwhelmed, rather than deepened. Both outcomes are possible from the same experience. Suffering alone does not determine the moral outcome. What matters is what happens to the suffering afterward, whether it opens the person toward others or closes them down. When the soil is poisoned, but the seed requires conditions. A child born into a community where cruelty is normalized, where trauma accumulates across generations without being named or processed, where survival has required the suppression of empathy. That child is not born without moral instinct, but it is buried under the weight of what survival required. The capacity for empathy that research shows is present from the earliest months of life can be overlaid by years of conditioning so thorough that the original instinct becomes inaccessible without enormous effort, and then something else happens. The mind that survived the forming period does not simply carry the wound. It builds a framework around the wound that makes the wound feel like wisdom. So the wound becomes a worldview. The harm received becomes evidence of how the world works. The harm given becomes evidence of strength, of cultural necessity, of survival logic. The indifference of others becomes proof that care is weakness. The cruelty of authority becomes the model for what power looks like. The entitlement arrives last. The quiet certainty that the harm is not only acceptable but deserved. That the target had it coming. That this is simply how things are. This is not evil in the dramatic sense. It is the ordinary operation of a human mind that was shaped by specific conditions and then protected itself by turning those conditions into a philosophy. Understanding this does not excuse the harm. It explains the mechanism. The question of what it would take to interrupt it, that remains open. The fragile thing. I do not think conscience is infinitely strong. Human beings can absolutely become desensitized. Entire societies can. Propaganda works. Fear works. Tribalism works. Power works. Comfort works. History proves this repeatedly. And yet, history also shows something else. Again and again, even inside deeply corrupted systems, some people still resist. Quietly, sometimes. Imperfectly. At enormous cost. A person tells the truth anyway. A stranger protects someone vulnerable anyway. A citizen refuses participation anyway. The system does not fully erase the conscience. It fights constantly to overpower it. The moral instinct, the conscience, the capacity to recognize dignity and cruelty for what they are, is present as a starting point. Everything else, every religion, every legal system, every political philosophy, every tradition of moral reasoning was built on top of it, sometimes honoring it, sometimes obscuring it, sometimes using the language of conscience to justify its opposite, which means that when we evaluate those systems, we already have a standard available. Not a perfect standard, not a complete one, but one that precedes every system that has ever tried to claim it. Those questions do not require a degree to ask. They require only the willingness to take seriously what you already sense, that some things cause real harm, that some things honor real dignity, and that the difference matters. Perhaps civilization depends largely on whether enough people keep that fragile thing alive in one another long enough for the next generation to inherit it too. This is the end of today's episode. If this chapter resonated with you, please consider following, sharing, and supporting the podcast. Thank you for listening. And remember, even in dark times, some lights refuse to stay out. See you next time.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode from AMCU Media, where real stories, healthcare, and advocacy come together. We release a new episode on the 28th of every month. We're a small, independent team doing our best to bring you meaningful conversations. And your support means the world to us. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and Facebook page. Just search for AMCU Media. Got a story or topic to share? Email us at amcu@strmedical.com.au. Together, we can do better. For care, for community, and for change. Until next time, thank you. And take care.